Hello, good morning, all. I should start off by saying that I very rarely go to building sites. I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect, so my background is not in this side of the conversation. But I do hope to talk to you about Enterprise Ireland, how Enterprise Ireland is evolving, how we're working more with sustainability as a core part of our DNA, but also about how we deal with some of the upstream problems. So the embedded emissions were mentioned. Cement is a very large emitter in Ireland, and it's my current problem that I need to decarbonize, and I will need all of your help to help me achieve the reductions in their emissions, and we can all work together on that one. So I'll provide you some data on that and also show how EU climate policy will affect the price of some of your products that you've become very accustomed to using as well. So who is Enterprise Ireland? Basically, we try to help Irish companies go global and be competitive. So we help small Irish SMEs to go into global markets and scale to become large competitive companies. You can think of us as the mirror image of the IDA. IDA brings companies into Ireland. We try to get companies to go out and go global from Ireland. We have about 4,000 clients, so it's a huge client base, primarily SMEs, so smaller companies below 250, but we do have some of the largest emitters in Ireland in our portfolio as well. We have offices throughout the world, and they can support Irish companies when they want to expand into new markets. So these are our major pillars. The fourth one is probably the most important one for this conversation, which is the new focus that Enterprise Ireland has on sustainability and making our clients as competitive and sustainable as possible. This pillar here was added maybe about 2.5 years ago, so it's really just bedding into the organization now as a core part of everything we do. And I'll give you more description of how that's affecting how we work with our clients and the obligations we're putting on our clients and the opportunities we're providing them through new funding as well. Okay, so how do we do this? We help companies start. We have a whole division that works with HPSUs. This is people leaving universities, people with a good idea, people who want to start new companies. We help with innovation. So we have a lot of support with R&D, help companies to have more time to invest in R&D, help bring new expertise into companies to encourage R&D, and just to increase innovation overall. And then scale. So this can be through either professionalization, it can be through helping them to go to global markets, or from my point of view, helping with capital investment so they can develop and build new productive systems. So let's say a new factory that is much lower carbon than a factory would otherwise be built. And I'll give an example of that as we go on. The bottom here gives kind of an overall idea of kind of the normal things we do between strategy development, leadership, export assistance, access to markets, and then funding support, and then finally ecosystem development. The funding support is the part that I work most closely with. So that's helping companies to make new investments and making sure those investments are as good as they can be and as future-proof as possible. So this means a lot of my job is informing companies about what the world of the 2030s will look like, what products will have access to markets, and what products will be slowly phased out due to CO2 emissions and due to new regulations coming in Europe, Ireland, and global markets in general. Okay, so that's Enterprise Ireland. That's the overall overview. We'll now have a conversation about Enterprise Ireland and sustainability and how that's slowly kind of worked its way into Enterprise Ireland overall. So these two papers here changed the world of Enterprise Ireland about the same time as I joined. So one is the Climate Action Plan. Here, this includes a line that the agencies, IDA and Enterprise Ireland, will align grants and other supports with emissions reductions. So this means that any of our supports that go out, let's say if we're helping to build a new factory, let's say we're helping to support a cement plant to expand, we need to find out how much emissions that will produce. Is there another way that factory could be developed? Are those products low carbon as they could be? And will they be compatible with the Climate Action Plan? So of course, for us, it's about 35% emission reduction from industry. Are our investments and are the way that we're working with companies compatible with that 35%? And if company is increasing emissions, we need to go in and see if we can redesign that investment to use different technologies so they do not increase emissions as much as possible where possible. We will also go to companies that currently exist who have plants that may be aging, and we'll ask them, can you change the way you work? Can you change the product you make? Or can you change the energy you use to reduce your emissions at your facility? So the IDA is doing the same, and SEI have been doing this for many years, but these agencies are working together to actively engage with their industrial emitters to reduce their emissions to get along the path to the climate action targets. And I have some data later on that I'll show you that a large part of these industrial emitters are the largest companies in Ireland. And the real standout one, and the one that we're really searching for a solution for, is cement. And of course, cement is used in construction, which is why I'm here essentially. On the far side, then we have carbon abatement is an objective equal to and alongside employment and value add. So before employment, increasing value add were the metrics that Enterprise Ireland and IDA were judged by, but now carbon abatement there as well. So we need to make sure again that everything we do is helping our companies to reduce emissions, and that we're bringing new companies, new products along that can contribute to Ireland's decarbonisation and future competitiveness in a low carbon world. Okay. This is just a kind of a small example of from the World Economic Forum of the risk register. A colleague of mine gave this to me. The green ones here on the left, they show that basically climate and sustainability are showing up here on the 2-year. They're in the top 10 of the risks. But every time when you run this again, when you go out to what is the risk in 10 years, you can see climate and sustainability jump up again. So this is a type of narrative that we're bringing into our clients to show that even though climate change and ESG not might be hitting you on the head today, it's something that's slowly boiling in the background all the time. Unless you're making consistent and constant investments and bringing that future view into your decisions now, eventually you'll become more marginal in the market. You will be under more stress over time unless you have products that are accessible to that world of the 2030s and the late 2020s, where climate change and ESG become increasingly more important every day. More of the softer kind of elements in this, and probably more relevant for the smaller companies, is that ESG and sustainability also affect day-to-day operations in a sense. We have many companies now that would never have talked about climate change, never talked about sustainability, but now they're seeing that they can tender into certain projects. So let's say they have their suppliers to a very large company. That large company is now requiring them to demonstrate their climate abatement plan, demonstrate their emissions, show their accounting, and show their plan to emissions reduction. And unless you have those, you can't even enter the market. You can't even tender into these companies. So we're helping our clients to build up the very basics of climate literacy, so they can start to engage and not be forced away from tendering, basically, in a sense. Recruitment. I had a conversation with a executive from Shell a few years ago, and he was whining to me that he couldn't get any good graduates to go join him. And I was quite surprised. Well, of course, who would want to work for an oil company? But we'll see that change over time as well. Who will want to work for a cement company? Who will want to work for a company that just doesn't engage in this topic at all, who refuses to reduce their emissions? This will become a silent and soft kind of effect on companies and this quality of people they can get over time. So again, engaging in emissions reduction, engaging in ESG, and be able to demonstrate that you're a part of the solution and not part of the problem is increasingly important to get the best staff. And it's just important to highlight that as well. And then investment, we hear a lot about green finance. So at the moment, if you're decarbonizing, you have a plan, you have a vision for you to be compatible in a low carbon world, you potentially have the access to more finance than other companies. And over time, companies that don't have plans may actually be removed or won't have access to finance in general. We see more and more finance coming on with the strings of the sustainability and the requirement for you to demonstrate how you are compatible in that world where carbon has a price, because that is now becoming a commercial risk. I know the comment was made that there's loads of training, and I probably agree. So here's 2 training courses that Enterprise Ireland has started just over the last year. They've been actually very successful. We've had hundreds of companies come through this. It's been quite interesting to see in the workshops how companies with no knowledge can start to open up and engage on sustainability more general and to start that conversation. So just highlighting these here, we'll run these again ongoing throughout this year as well. So if you want more training and you want to engage, these are free and open to all clients of Enterprise Ireland. So please just jump on the website or give me an email after this. Okay, so from now on, we'll go and talk a little bit about the data. I'll try to give you an overview of what industrial emissions look like in Ireland and talk about some of the solutions where they exist and how maybe different parts of the construction sector become a really integral part of both the problem and the solution. So there was a better graph in the previous presentation of a pathway of emissions reduction. This basically means the same thing. By 2050, we need to be net zero. It's like 24 full years away, so very, very close. And we have huge emission reductions to do to 2035. For industry, what I deal with is about 35%. Overall, in the European Union, it's about 55%. I think that might currently be negotiated to increase. Either way, we have a lot of work to do to reduce our emissions from all aspects of society, not just power plants, not just cement plants, but in all aspects of society, we need to drastically reduce emissions. I guess I could make the point that if we started 10 years ago, this journey would be easier, but we haven't. So we need to bring emissions down like a ski slope, basically. Okay, here's some data. So this is little bit out of date. This is 2022. This is the EPA data for industrial emitters in Ireland. We might call them enterprise emitters. It's about 6.5 million tons, so roughly about 10% of Ireland's overall emissions. This is all public data. You can see that cement is the largest. That's the two blue boxes at the top. And why cement is broken into two blue boxes is that the darker blue is combustion emissions. In the cement plant, you burn fuel to calcine, basically, to make your clinker. And then above that, these are the process emissions. So these come out of the actual chemical process of producing cement. So even if cement was entirely powered by renewable electricity, 100% powered, 65% of the emissions from cement would remain. The CO2 that comes from cement production is intrinsic to the chemistry of the product. So you can't just wish it away, and we're looking for a solution for that will be quite complicated. And I'll give you a description of what that looks like in a moment. Fortunately, about 4 million of the overall tons come from general fossil fuel combustion. And I would say that overall, we have solutions for those available. Electrification is a huge part of that. We also have biomethane and general efficiency can really do a lot on that. We are beginning to see some very cool projects come through. I hope maybe in the next year or so, you'll be able to find about some very large production facilities in Ireland being able to demonstrate that they will be net zero quite soon. Or I actually shouldn't say net zero, I should say zero, just no tons of CO2, So we will have those first lighthouse projects to show us how we can do things very differently without a huge impact on the bottom line. And companies can really show that they can be zero emissions and produce the products that we use every day in a way that doesn't harm the climate. From this graph here, 85% of these are in the EU ETS. So the EU ETS is the EU emissions trading scheme. This is the EU carbon tax, basically. The fact that 85% of emissions come from that means that most of our industrial emissions are in large emitters. The EU ETS only deals with large emitters. So of this group here, I would say we probably have between 75 and 100 companies responsible for 95% of those emissions. So they come from there's a few real big factories basically that produce most of our emissions. And that means from Enterprise Ireland's point of view, trying to reduce this by 35%, there's a small hot list of companies that we work with every day to get them to consider new investments and to work to reduce their emissions. Okay, so here's one of a small conversation about what the EU ETS is and how it might affect our lives in this room, basically. So this might be a bit far from what you're used to talking about. And this graph, it actually came from a report that was released 2 days ago, so it's quite new. So the CO2 price that industry was charged in the past is this line over here, that kind of first line there from 2010 on. It was almost entirely ignorable. One, the CO2 price was very, very low. For a long time, it was about €5. Sometimes it got up to €20, but generally it's about €10. Very, very low. So the amount that companies would have to pay for CO2 was almost negligible. They didn't care, it never got to boardroom levels. And even on top of that, most industry was given 100% free allocation. So then they were given all the permits for free. So it didn't matter what the price was. So until very, very recently, industry didn't really care too much about CO2 emissions because of course they were in the ETS, but the ETS provided no financial liability for them to actually change their production practices. And that's because there was free allocation. The big thing that's happened in the last 2 years basically is that the CO2 price has shot up. It went from €20 all the way up to €100. It's about up there now. That's a significant amount of money. And also free allocation. These free permits that industry get are now going to be removed. From 2026 to 2033, they'll be gone entirely. And that means the carbon price applies to industry becomes real, tangible. And for large emitters, so let's say you have a cement plant that emits 1 million tons of CO2. If you emit 1 million tons of CO2 every year and you're charged €100 per ton, that's a lot of money. So it's just a point of saying that CO2 for some of these industries becomes a real commercial driver of their future activities, and it will become a big driver of the cost of their product that you choose to use when you're designing and speccing a building. So again, from the same report, and I confirm these numbers are about right, this shows that when free allocation is removed and we have the full cost of carbon is borne by these companies, this shows what the effect of the new carbon price will have on the price of the product. So here on the left, you can see cement is the most exposed. So at the moment, they're saying that cement is not really affected by CO2 because the cost isn't really applied. But when the CO2 cost is applied, it will go up to about half of the revenues. The amount of money they'll be spending on CO2 emissions alone, if they don't change how they produce, will be half of their revenues. And I think you can extrapolate that is also going to be passed on to the product. So you would expect the price of cement on the way to double, basically, if they don't find a way of reducing their emissions. So if you're designing a building, with normal traditional cement, that will have effect on the price of your building over time as cement gets more and more expensive due to the price of CO2. The same is true of steel, lesser extent chemicals. But this, there is ways to get around this. You can re-engineer a cement plant to emit far less CO2. That means they wouldn't have to pay this price. Their cement would be cheaper. You'd prefer to buy it. Or you could use alternative cements entirely. So I'll give a small example of that. Again, just to focus on cement and the ways of solutions that we're looking at, you can reduce the combustion of cement. You can do carbon capture. It's very difficult. You can reformulate cements. We will work with companies for them to do R&D to come up with new types of cement. But then we also need people to use these new types of cements. So we need consumers like yourselves to say, I am willing and eager and excited to use alternative cement blends. And then there's reduced cement intensity overall. This is how can we design a building that we don't overspecify cement, that we don't need cement where it's not needed, basically. These are what we will need to bring those emissions down in industry. For me to get to my goals, I will need people in this room to change how they build buildings, change how they specify buildings, to make sure that we're using cement where appropriate and using the type of cement blends that are required. Okay, I will just tell you about the money and then I'll leave. So Enterprise Ireland, a core part of what we do is providing grants. On the left here, we have Green Start and Green Plus. These are grants up to about 100,000 euros or so. They're there to help companies build a climate plan, educate their staff, work with consultants, and kind of have the first idea of like, what does climate change mean to you as a company, to you as your product, and what can you do about it? How are you exposed? Here in the middle, strategic consultancy. This is really designed where we go in and do a real investable plan for your facility to find out how can we redesign your facility to remove that gas boiler and put in a heat pump, or to change the product you make entirely and the chemistry of it. So you're not making a traditional cement, you're making a new low carbon cement. And then finally, we have capital, the do part. This is where we will help pay for these investments to happen, to accelerate them, and to make sure that these investments happen as soon as possible, so we bring emissions down as soon as possible. Also, it's very, very nice to have these first mover projects, because then you can demonstrate to everyone that seeing is believing. If your competitor can do it, you can do it too. Okay, and I'll leave you just on one note. This is the EU ETS numbers came out on Tuesday, so it's quite new. This is the emissions for the EI clients, so not all of the list, but most of the list. So emissions are down 5.2% year on year, which is quite good. We've dropped 2 years in a row now. And emissions from 2018, which is our baseline basically, are down 9.7%. So we're not doing so bad. You can see there was a spike there after COVID, but we're again coming back on track. As I mentioned, our goal is about 35%-ish emissions reduction by 2030. So we are on the way. We're not totally failing here. So there is some positive news. So my goal and my job will be to keep that graph going down the whole way to 2030 and continue afterwards. And I hope everyone in this room can help with that, basically. Cheers. Thank you.